Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The fluorescent lights buzzed above, cold and unflattering, making every detail sharper, harsher. Lieutenant Sarah stood at the edge of the room. Her notes clutched tightly in her hands. She wasn't late. She wasn't unprepared, yet to the men crowding the table, she was invisible, just a weather specialist, a name on the roster, filling a seat that protocol demanded. Captain Hayes didn't bother to hide his disdain. He scanned the room, eyes sliding over Sarah as if she were an empty chair. His voice was loud, rehearsed, carrying the weight of authority he had never tested in the places that mattered most. "This is a job for real pilots," he said finally, the words sharp enough to slice through the hum of machines and the scratching pens. Then, with the kind of casual cruelty that burns deeper than open hostility, he added, "Why don't you go file some paperwork while the men handle this crisis?" A ripple moved through the room. A few officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Most stared harder at their maps and notepads, and Sarah, her heart pressed tight against her ribs, stood in silence. She could have left it there. She could have walked out with the folder in her hand and buried herself in paperwork as ordered. But she didn't. Instead, she tightened her grip on the data sheets she had spent the last 6 hours analyzing. The numbers told a story none of them wanted to hear. A storm system, violent, unpredictable, alive, was sweeping through the Cascade Range, and 8 of their best pilots were lost in it. The irony wasn't lost on her. A woman who had grown up tracing wind currents with her fingertips in the cockpit of her father's small, who had flown mountains others feared to cross, was now being treated like an overzealous intern. But she stayed because her instincts whispered what no one else in that sterile command room seemed willing to admit. 8 lives were slipping away, and every wasted minute pushed them closer to the silence that comes before a name is carved into stone. She didn't speak, not yet, because sometimes the only thing more dangerous than a storm outside is arrogance inside. Her memory carried her backward. Back to when she was a girl, her father's voice came first. It was steady, patient, warm against the roar of propellers. "Feel that turbulence, kiddo. That's not chaos, that's the mountain talking. You don't fight it, you listen, you dance with it." Sarah had learned to listen long before she had learned to argue. At 14, she could read the sky like most kids read novels. By 16, she could predict shifts the weather service missed. By 18, she had already logged more flight hours in rugged mountain terrain than some of the officers now pretending she wasn't in the room. But that didn't matter here. What mattered was rank, protocol, the chain of command, and Captain Hayes sat at the top of this room's fragile hierarchy. He puffed his chest and paced. His words filled the air with confidence that sounded convincing enough for anyone who didn't know better. He had experience, yes, but not the kind that bleeds, not the kind you earn through cracked windscreens and emergency landings on jagged. Sarah glanced down at her printouts again. The storm wasn't moving like a storm should. Wind shear patterns, electromagnetic interference, invisible funnels that could trap an aircraft and grind it down. She knew this language. She'd seen it once before, in the Olympic Mountains. She had pulled a civilian pilot out of it by flying where no manual would dare instruct her to fly. And she had lived to tell the tale only because she trusted what her gut told her more than what her instruments said. Now the same phenomenon was here, and 8 combat veterans, men with thousands of hours and reputations carved in steel, were in its grip. And command refused to see it. Her throat tightened with the humiliation of Hayes' dismissal. She had expected skepticism, maybe resistance, but to be reduced to paperwork. While lives hung in balance, it burned. She kept her face composed, but inside, anger mixed with something heavier, a quiet dread. It wasn't just professional pride. She knew some of the pilots out there. She'd shared simulators, trading maneuvers with them, laughing in the cafeteria when exercises were done. She remembered one of them, teasing her about her uncanny, sky-reading superpowers. She remembered the flight leader, who had once shaken her hand and told her she had a nose for weather that put satellites to shame. They weren't just names in a report, they were people. And now, as the storm grew darker, the thought pressed harder into her chest. They were dying. Sarah stayed in her corner as the briefing droned on. Officers debated search grids, systematic sweeps, radar-based tracking. She wanted to scream. The interference was crippling radar. The storm's spiral meant the pilots would be funneled into specific valleys, not scattered across an endless grid. But when she raised her hand, when she cleared her throat, Hayes didn't even let her finish. "Lieutenant," he said with that same smile, "your job is weather forecasts, leave the tactics to us." The words rang in her ears. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to breathe her father's lessons, Jack's coaching at the municipal airport. Trust the air, stay calm, don't fight. But this wasn't turbulence, this was arrogance. And arrogance kills just as surely as weather does. Time passed, rescue flights launched, then returned, their pilots pale and shaken, systems fried, reports filled with turbulence and interference so severe that pushing farther in had nearly killed them. The grid search failed again, and still Hayes clung to procedure. Evening crept over the base, the light outside dimmed, shadows long against the mountain ridges. Sarah remained at her station, watching the data streams pour across her screen. She could see it clearly now, the pattern, the rhythm every 3 hours. The storm opened for less than an hour. A fragile window where interference dropped, where instruments flickered back to life. It was rare, dangerous, but predictable. She stared at the clock. If they waited another 3 hours, the pilots might not last that long, cold, injuries, fuel gone. Human will doesn't hold forever. Her hands trembled as she tightened the strap of her watch. She knew what she had to do. 8 lives balanced on a knife edge. The command would not act, and if she disobeyed, her career might end tonight. But careers are paper, lives are flesh. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the way her father used to end their flights. "The sky doesn't care about rank, kiddo, only about respect. Respect it, and it will let you through. Ignore it, and it will break you." Her choice was already made. She straightened, the hum of the command center pressing in. Officers still shuffled papers. Hayes still barked orders, pretending control, and Sarah, ignored, dismissed, humiliated, quietly gathered her maps and her portable weather kit. Her heartbeat slowed, determination drowned out fear. If they wouldn't listen, she would show them. And what would follow, no one in that room could have imagined. Because sometimes dignity doesn't argue, sometimes it doesn't speak. It acts. How do you decide when silence becomes betrayal? Sarah stared at the glowing storm data on her screen, the numbers dancing like warnings only she could read around her. The command center pulsed with noise, radios crackling, officers murmuring, Captain Hayes barking updates like a man clinging to the illusion of control. But inside her chest, a different rhythm pounded, a countdown. She saw the opening, the window, less than 40 minutes of navigable sky forming in the teeth of the storm. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't safe, but it was real. And if someone didn't take it, the next chance wouldn't come for hours. Hours the stranded pilots didn't have. Her fingers tightened around the edges of her charts. She imagined their faces, major, calm under pressure, but mortal all the same. The one who had once laughed at her uncanny instincts. The others, whose voices still echoed in memory from flight briefings and late-night mess hall banter. They weren't just call signs on a missing aircraft list. They were men, brothers in arms, fighting the cold, fighting despair, waiting for someone to come. But the command didn't see them, not really, to Hayes. They were a problem of logistics, a knot in his career rope. To Sarah, they were people. And the longer she stood here silent, the more it felt like complicity in their deaths. She rose slowly, deliberately, her chair's legs scraped the tile, and a few heads turned, startled by the movement. "Captain," she said, her voice steady though her stomach churned, "I've identified a break in the interference pattern. If we launch immediately, we'll have a 30 to 40-minute corridor, enough to reach them, enough to bring them back." For a heartbeat, the command center stilled. Hayes looked at her as though she had slapped him in front of his men. "Lieutenant," he snapped, his tone icy, "we do not gamble lives on guesswork. You are out of line." "It's not guesswork," Sarah pressed, her pulse hammered, but she kept her voice even. "The interference is cycling. Every 3 hours a stability window forms. I've tracked it all day. We're inside one now. If we don't act, we lose them." Gasps whispered at the edges of the room. Even Captain Jack, the grizzled veteran whose respect carried weight, lifted his head from his notes. Hayes's face darkened. "That's enough. Whether predictions do not dictate tactical operations, you will stand down, Lieutenant." "Stand down." The words echoed, heavy, final. Sarah felt the heat rising in her throat. For a moment she thought she might break, might lower her gaze, sit back down, let the men keep playing their games of procedure. That would be easier, safer. She was junior, female, the outsider in this room of rank and ego. She had no right, no power. But then she heard it again, her father's voice, not memory this time, commanding, alive in her chest. "The smart ones listen, the brave ones act." She straightened, lifting her charts and crossing the room until she stood directly before Hayes. Her boots struck the tile like the ticking of a clock. The weight of every eye in the room pressed on her. But she didn't waver. "Sir," she said formally, almost softly, "permission to present time-critical intelligence." Hayes froze. To refuse outright would expose him, not just as arrogant but as negligent, and everyone in the room knew it. The silence grew heavy. 2 long seconds, 3, then, with a sneer that couldn't quite disguise his unease, Hayes gestured toward the table. "You have 2 minutes." Sarah spread her charts, hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. She walked them through it. The cycles of interference, the rhythm of the vortex, the predictable gaps. She showed how instruments had failed at the same moments across multiple flights, how the anomalies lined up with the mountain's geography, how a pilot, guided in real time, could slip through. The data glowed on the screen, a pattern clear as a heartbeat. "This," she said quietly, "isn't a guess, it's a window, and right now it's open." Silence followed then from the back. Dr. Warren, the civilian meteorologist brought in as a consultant, spoke first. "She's right," her tone carried awe, not hesitation. "These cycles explain the radar ghosts, the navigation failures, everything. I've never seen analysis like this, but it's sound." Leaned forward, eyes sharp. "How confident are you, Lieutenant?" "Confident enough to fly it myself," Sarah replied. The room held its breath. Hayes's face burned crimson. He opened his mouth to reassert authority. But at that exact moment the radios crackled, a voice, faint, fractured by static. "Command Alpha 7, critical fuel state, attempting emergency landing, GPS unreliable, need immediate." The line dissolved into white noise. But it was enough, proof of life, desperation. The 8 weren't gone, not yet. The room shifted. Doubt cracked the walls of Hayes's authority, stood, slow and deliberate. His gravelly voice carried more weight than Hayes's shouts ever had. "Sir, she's right. If there's even a chance, we can't wait. I'll take a bird. She rides co-pilot. We fly her window." For a moment, Hayes looked like a man drowning. Then, cornered by reality, he gave a curt nod that carried the weight of surrender disguised as command. "Fine," he spat. "Prep your aircraft. Lieutenant, you're his weather specialist. You'll have your chance. Don't waste it." Sarah exhaled. Relief mingled with terror. This was it. As she strapped her gear and grabbed her portable weather kit, caught her eye, his expression wasn't patronizing, wasn't skeptical. It was raw trust. He said, voice low as they approached the aircraft, "I'm betting my life and theirs on your sky reading. Don't let me down." She met his gaze steady. "I won't." The helicopter's rotors thundered to life, blades slicing the night. Outside, the storm boiled black against the jagged teeth of the Cascades. Inside, the cabin rattled, the smell of metal and fuel sharp in Sarah's lungs. Her hands trembled only once. As they lifted off, leaving the relative safety of base behind. She pressed them against her knees, forced herself to breathe. 37 minutes. That was all they had before the window slammed shut. The storm swallowed them quickly. Visibility shrank to almost nothing. Lightning stitched across the clouds. The helicopter shuddered, buffeted by turbulence. Hands gripped the stick like it was a living thing, but his voice remained steady. "Navigation holding," he said. "So far, your cycle's spot on. How long do we have?" Sarah glanced at her instruments. The readings pulsed, alive, like a heartbeat she could feel in her chest. 33 minutes. Every second mattered. She watched the data as they cut deeper into the range, her eyes flicking from charts to skis to trembling needles. She called out crosswinds before they hit, downdrafts before the helicopter dropped, adjusted, trusting her completely. And then contact. The beacons weak but there, multiple signals, survivors. "Got M," breathed. "Bearing 270, distance 8 clicks." Sarah's chest tightened, relief, fear both at once. As the helicopter tilted toward the valley, her eyes caught something else. The interference spikes beginning to climb again. Their window was already thinning. She clenched her jaw, forcing her voice to stay calm. 20 minutes. That's all we've got before instruments start failing. Didn't flinch. He only pushed the aircraft harder, his voice a low growl. "Then let's bring them home." The storm raged, the helicopter shook, and Sarah's charts glowed beneath trembling hands. Every beat of the rotor was another second gone, another inch closer to 8 men who had nothing left but hope that someone, anyone, would dare the impossible for them. And Sarah, dismissed as the weather girl, was about to prove that sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the power to change everything. What do you do when the sky itself turns against you? The helicopter shuddered violently as it cut into the mouth of the valley, the rotors clawing at air that seemed to shift direction with every passing second. Sarah's eyes flicked from the trembling needles on her portable station to the dark looming below. The mountains were invisible shapes in the night, black teeth rising to swallow them whole. His voice crackled over the comm, steady but tight. "Talk to me, what's she saying?" Sarah didn't need to ask who she was. The sky, the storm, the mountain's voice, her father had always called it. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing against the glow of her instruments, reading patterns invisible to anyone else. "Crosswind, 20 degrees starboard, downdraft ahead, hold altitude." Corrected instantly, trusting her calls without hesitation, the helicopter steadied, but only barely. Then, through the static of interference, the signal flared again. Beacons, multiple, weak but alive. "There," Sarah pointed, her voice trembling with urgency. "Bearing 270, 5 kilometers." Banked the aircraft hard. The valley opened beneath them in the sweep of the searchlight, revealing a brutal scene. 4 fighter jets lay scattered like broken toys across the jagged terrain. One fuselage torn open along a riverbank, another half buried in snow near a ridge. The other 2 wedged into the valley floor. Their wings snapped like twigs. But the beacons were still calling, and then voices. "This is..." The transmission was weak, ragged. "6 survivors here. 2 injured bad, lost contact with Alpha 75 and 78. They went down upslope." Sarah's breath caught. 6 alive, 2 missing. Her voice steadied, cutting through the storm's chaos. "We'll get them all, Major, hold on." His jaw tightened as he hovered the bird, fighting gusts that tried to slam them into the cliff face. The rescue crew moved fast, ropes and winches screaming against the wind. Sarah leaned close to the glass, scanning the terrain, her heart pounding with every shadow. She called out wind changes as if she could feel them in her bones. "Port side gust incoming. Now. Downdraft under the ridge, compensate." Each call gave the seconds he needed to keep them stable. Without her voice, the helicopter would already be wreckage alongside the fighters. Below, the crew hauled the first survivor up, a young pilot whose leg bent at an angle it shouldn't. His face was pale, lips trembling blue, but his eyes locked on Sarah as though she alone had pulled him out. Another came next, then another, 4 with minor injuries, able to climb, clinging to the rope with desperation, and then 2 more strapped into harnesses, their bodies broken but alive. Inside the cabin, cramped and heavy with the smell of blood and hydraulic oil, Sarah helped steady them as the medics worked. She pressed a hand against one man's shoulder. His skin was cold through the flight suit. His eyes, glassy with pain, focused on her. "You came," he whispered. Sarah swallowed hard, nodding once. "We weren't leaving you." The words shook her more than she expected, because a part of her, dark and guilty, had feared they wouldn't, that the command's arrogance would let these men freeze in the dark, that Hayes' refusal to listen would have written their epitaphs. But here they were, breathing. His voice snapped her back, "Time check." She glanced at her instruments. The readings trembled, already beginning to waver. 18 minutes before interference spikes. Cursed under his breath, eyes narrowing on the beyond, not enough to play it safe. Sarah's hands trembled against her charts. She knew what he was about to do before he spoke. "We're going upslope if the other 2 are alive. They don't have 3 hours to wait." Her throat tightened. The rational part of her screamed against it. The window was closing, the helicopter already overloaded, but she looked at the 6 battered faces around her, men clinging to life because she had dared to act, and she knew was right. "We'll make it," she said quietly, "but I'll need to call every gust, every shift." "Then you'd better not miss." Shoved the stick forward, and the helicopter clawed toward the ridge. The storm seemed to sense their defiance. The wind screamed louder, tearing at the rotors. Sheets of snow lashed against the windshield, and lightning forked across illuminating the valley for a heartbeat before plunging them back into blackness. Sarah's world narrowed to the dials and the sky. She read the subtle shifts, the twitch of vapor, the dip of pressure, and shouted over the roar. "Downdraft coming, 3 seconds now, bank left, hold, hold." Responded like an extension of her instincts. Together they rode the violence like dancers keeping step in a rhythm no one else could hear. And then the beacon. Weak stuttering, nearly lost in the interference, but there. "Contact bearing 045 2 kilometers, Sarah shouted. Pushed harder, the helicopter groaning under strain. The searchlight swept the slope, revealing the twisted wreckage of Alpha 75. It clung to the mountainside like a broken bird, its fuselage split, wings sheared. A beacon pulsed weakly from within. "Talk to me." His knuckles whitened on the stick. She scanned her readings. The window was almost gone. Barely 9 minutes left before the storm's interference devoured them whole. "Wind shear coming off the ridge. Hold steady, compensate starboard." The helicopter bucked hard, nearly flipping, but fought it back under control. Below, the rescue specialist rappelled down, swinging wildly in the gale. Sarah held her breath until his voice crackled over comms. "Survivor located. Alive but critical, beginning stabilization." Relief hit like a punch. 1 alive, 1 more to go. Sarah's eyes darted back to her readings. The interference spiked higher, needles trembling, lights flickering. 7 minutes, she whispered. Her father's voice rose again in her memory. "Respect the sky, kiddo, but don't let it scare you silent." She raised her voice. "We have to move fast, 1 more signal out there." "Then we find him," growled. The pilot came up slowly, strapped to the harness. His flight suit shredded, 1 arm hanging limp. Blood streaked his face, but his chest rose and fell, alive barely. The crew pulled him inside, medics already working. Sarah didn't let herself linger. She scanned again, searching for the last faint pulse in the interference. And there, flickering, almost drowned out but unmistakable. Beacon Alpha 78, bearing northeast 1.8 kilometers. Turned hard, engines screaming. Sarah's instruments wailed. The interference cycle was collapsing faster than she had predicted. Navigation needles spun. The portable station blinked red warnings. Her stomach twisted. They were out of time. "Sir," she shouted over the roar, "systems are failing. If we push it, we might not get back." Didn't hesitate, his voice was steel. "We don't leave people behind." The helicopter clawed through the turbulence, every second a gamble, every gust a threat to tear them from the sky. Sarah's charts blurred in the shaking light, her instruments nearly blind. She fell back on instinct, on memory, on the way her father had taught her to read the invisible. "Wind shift port side now, downdraft ahead, brace." They cleared the ridge by meters, the skids grazing snow, before the searchlight revealed the wreck Alpha 78 crumpled against a cliffside, its beacon faint but still pulsing. Sarah's chest ached with relief. He was alive, he had to be. But the storm had no mercy left. The interference roared, lights flickering across every panel. The helicopter bucked, gritting his teeth as alarms screamed. He barked, "I can't hold this long, call it." She forced herself calm, eyes narrowing on the slope, gust shifting 10 seconds, hold steady now, now drop. The cable unspooled, the rescue specialist vanishing into the storm. Seconds stretched into eternities. Sarah's hands dug into her knees until her nails bit skin. The helicopter shook so hard it felt like the bolts would rip free. "Survivor located." The voice came faint, almost drowned out, unconscious but breathing, bringing him up. Sarah exhaled, the air leaving her lungs in a rush. The last pilot rose through the storm, limp in the harness but alive. The moment his boots touched the cabin floor, pulled them out of the valley, engines screaming as the interference cycle collapsed completely. Every instrument failed at once, lights flickered, navigation needles spun aimlessly. But Sarah leaned forward, pressing her hand against the glass, eyes scanning the sky with a desperation carved into her bones. "There," she whispered, spotting the faint break in the clouds, the rhythm of the wind. "Angle 20 degrees starboard, trust me." Didn't question, he obeyed. And together, blind but not lost, they clawed their way out of the storm. 8 survivors bleeding, freezing, but alive in the cabin behind them. Sarah's chest burned with exhaustion, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. Because for the first time that night, hope wasn't just a word. It was breathing, it was bleeding, it was alive. And she had brought it back. How do you carry 8 lives when your own is dangling by a thread? The helicopter groaned under the weight, its engine screaming as if protesting every extra pound. The cabin was cramped with bodies, 6 conscious, 2 unconscious, all battered and bleeding. Medics worked furiously in the narrow space, voices clipped and urgent. The smell of blood mingled with fuel and cold air pouring through a crack in the side hatch. His jaw was clenched, sweat running down his temple despite the freezing air. His hands gripped the stick so tightly his knuckles looked carved from stone. He barked, his voice raw with effort. "I've got nothing. Nav's dead, compass spinning, talk to me." Sarah's instruments had already surrendered to the interference. The portable station flickered erratically, its signals dissolving into static. She stared at the useless screens for a moment, then shut her eyes. She could almost hear her father whispering, "When the sky blinds your tools, you use your skin. Trust the rhythm, trust the signs." Sarah pressed her palm against the cold glass of the window, searching the dark horizon. The storm writhed like a living thing. Flashes of lightning revealed the outlines of ridges, valleys, jagged teeth of rock waiting to tear them apart. The air currents slammed against the helicopter in bursts, unpredictable, violent. She forced herself to breathe, slow and steady, listening with every nerve in her body. "Port side gust in 3-2 now," she shouted. Corrected instantly, fighting the stick, the helicopter lurched but leveled. Sarah opened her eyes, narrowing them against the darkness. The clouds shifted in patterns she knew too well. The subtle color of vapor, the curl of mist against the ridge, the way the snow whipped sideways at different altitudes. She called them out one by one, her voice sharp, clipped, rhythmic. Downdraft ahead. Brace, crosswind, starboard 20 degrees, hold steady. Each command was a thread keeping them alive. Flew as if tied to her words, trusting them more than his own instruments. Behind them, a pilot groaned. One of the medics barked. "We're losing pressure. He needs a hospital now." Sarah swallowed, forcing back the knot in her throat. There was no hospital unless she got them out. Her eyes flicked to the portable station again. The interference needle was climbing, red against black. The window was gone. They were flying blind through chaos that wanted them broken against the mountainside. Growled through gritted teeth, "We're not gonna hold this long." "Yes, we are," she shot back, sharper than she meant, then softer, steadier. "We have to." The storm answered with a roar, tossing the helicopter so violently that one of the medics was thrown sideways. Sarah grabbed a rail to keep herself upright, her heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at her to fear, to panic, to accept that this was impossible. But she remembered something her father once said as they flew into a wall of fog off the Pacific. "Fear is noise. The air will still tell you the truth, if you're quiet enough to hear it." She forced the noise away. The fear, the shouts, the alarms, gone. Only the air remained. She leaned closer to the glass, watching. "There's a gap," she whispered, then louder. 10 degrees starboard, climb now, trust me." He didn't hesitate. The helicopter rose, cutting into a dark corridor between two ridges. Lightning flashed, revealing a narrow pass. Invisible on instruments but etched into Sarah's mind from the topographic maps she'd memorized. It was there, their way out. But the air currents were savage. The pass was a wind tunnel, currents slamming down from above, sucking sideways from the cliffs, fought with every muscle, sweat dripping, arms trembling. Call it now." Downdraft, hold steady. Crosswind coming left, now compensate. Climb 5 degrees, brace, brace. The helicopter bucked like a wild animal. Sarah's stomach flipped, her teeth rattling, but her voice never faltered. She gave seconds of warning, just enough for him to anticipate, to survive. They cleared the pass with meters to spare. The ridges dropped behind them, replaced by open sky. Still storming, still dangerous, but freer than the prison of mountains. Relief swept the cabin, but it was fragile, fleeting. One of the medics shouted again, "We're losing him." Sarah turned, the youngest of the pilots, blood crusted on his temple, lay pale and still on the stretcher. His breathing was shallow, ragged. The medic's hands worked frantically, pressing, stabilizing, but the truth hung heavy in the cabin. Time was running out. Sarah looked at him, her chest aching. He was barely more than a boy, maybe 23. She remembered him in the cafeteria weeks ago, laughing with about a simulator mishap. She remembered how young his smile looked. And now his life was a thread fraying in front of her. Her jaw set, she turned back to the storm. "We need speed, every second counts." "It'll tear us apart," he shot back, voice ragged. "Then hold us together," she said, sharper than steel. He glanced at her, eyes meeting hers for a split second, and he nodded. The helicopter surged forward, engines howling. Sarah's voice became the lifeline, sharp, urgent, relentless. "Crosswind left, compensate. Turbulence ahead, brace. Downdraft in 5, hold steady now." Every correction kept them alive by inches. The cabin rattled, bolts screaming against the stress, but they flew. Sarah's throat burned from shouting, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, 8 lives pressed on her chest, every face etched into her vision. If she faltered, if she missed even one call, they would all be gone. She caught sight of lights, faint, distant, flickering through the storm, the base home. Her breath hitched. "I see it, 10 kilometers, hold on." The storm fought them to the last. Crosswinds slammed, turbulence clawed, instruments spun useless. But Sarah's eyes never left the sky. She called every shift, every break, every invisible thread of air. And then the storm thinned, the interference eased. The ground radar picked them up, a faint blip on the command center screens. Back at base, voices erupted, commanders leaned forward disbelieving. That's them, they're coming in. In the cockpit's voice cracked, hoarse with exhaustion. Final approach, call it. Sarah pressed her palm to the glass one last time, reading the currents like scripture. Straight in, wind light, you've got her. The helicopter touched down hard, skids slamming against the tarmac. The medics swarmed, pulling stretchers, shouting orders. The survivors were lifted into waiting ambulances. The youngest rushed first. Inside the cabin, Sarah sat frozen, her chest heaving, her hands shook violently now that it was over. She hadn't realized she was crying until she felt the salt on her lips. Leaned back in his seat, eyes closing for a brief second before opening again. He turned to her, voice low. You did it. She shook her head, voice breaking. We did it. But inside, she knew, every correction, every call, every instinct had been the thread between life and death. And tonight, she had held that thread. Outside, floodlights bathed the landing pad in harsh white. The command staff gathered, Captain Hayes at their center. His face was pale, his posture stiff, his authority shattered. He had dismissed her, mocked her, humiliated her, and now, 8 pilots were alive because she had refused to stay silent. Sarah stepped down from the helicopter, her boots striking the wet tarmac. The night air bit at her skin, but her heart was hotter than fire. No one spoke at first, then, slowly, the silence broke. Applause, a ripple that grew until it filled the pad, the sound of relief, gratitude, awe. Sarah stood still, the noise washing over her, her face unreadable. She hadn't done it for applause. She hadn't done it for recognition. She had done it because she couldn't do otherwise. Because sometimes silence is betrayal. And tonight she had chosen to speak with action. How do you measure the cost of survival? The medical bay burned with fluorescent light and urgency. Doctors shouted across curtained bays. Monitors beeped in uneven rhythms, and the air smelled of antiseptic and blood. Stretchers rattled past in hurried procession, each carrying a pilot whose face was pale with exhaustion or pain. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, her flight suit still damp with sweat and storm-soaked air. Her ears rang from the constant thrum of rotors that no longer spun, her body still vibrating as though the helicopter hadn't landed at all. She should have felt relief, triumph, even. 8 lives had been saved against odds that had looked impossible. Yet as she watched the medics press chest seals to wounds, inject morphine into trembling arms, cut open flight suits stained dark with blood, she felt only the weight of fragility. Survival wasn't clean, it wasn't neat. It was messy, painful, filled with scars that wouldn't vanish when the stitches did. A nurse brushed past her, muttering under her breath, "He's crashing, push the line, move, move." Sarah caught a glimpse of the youngest pilot, the boy she remembered laughing in the cafeteria, his chest heaving against the oxygen mask as doctors crowded over him. His blood smeared the sheets crimson. Her breath caught and she gripped the doorframe until her knuckles ached. She wanted to move, to help, but this wasn't her fight, not anymore. She had guided them out of the storm, but now they were in other hands. Behind her, a voice cleared gently, "Lieutenant." She turned. Major stood there, pale, his left arm bandaged tightly across his chest, but his posture still carried the authority of a flight leader. His eyes met hers with a steady gratitude that words could barely hold. "You brought us home," he said simply. Sarah shook her head, her voice hoarse. "We just found the window you held on." His lips curved in something halfway between a smile and grimace. "Holding on doesn't save anyone if no one comes. Don't downplay what you did." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the chaos of the medical bay swirling around them. Then footsteps clicked against the tile. Captain Hayes entered, flanked by staff officers. His uniform was immaculate, his posture stiff, but his eyes betrayed the weight of something he couldn't polish away: humiliation. The room seemed to shift as he approached, conversations softening, glances turning. Everyone knew. Everyone had watched him dismiss Sarah again and again, his arrogance nearly costing lives, and everyone had seen her step into the storm and return with all 8 pilots alive. He stopped in front of her, clearing his throat. His face held none of the sneering disdain he had wielded earlier. Instead, there was the expression of a man forced to choke down the bitter taste of being wrong. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice formal, each word measured, "your atmospheric analysis saved lives tonight, 8 of them. That fact is indisputable." The silence in the room thickened. Some of the medics glanced up, listening, Evan's eyes sharpened. Hayes hesitated, his jaw tightening, before adding, "I owe you an apology. My dismissal of your expertise was inappropriate, and I will ensure it is reflected in the official record." Sarah looked at him, her face unreadable. She wanted to feel satisfaction, vindication, something sharp and righteous. But instead, she felt only exhaustion. "Sir," she said quietly, "what matters is they're alive." Hayes's eyes flickered. Whether with relief or further embarrassment, she couldn't tell. He gave a curt nod and stepped back, retreating toward the officers clustered behind him. His authority remained intact on paper, but everyone in the room knew the truth tonight. His rank hadn't mattered. Sarah turned back to the wounded pilots. Hayes's apology was nothing compared to the sight of lifting his head from the stretcher just long enough to give her a weary thumbs up, or the way the youngest pilot, still half-conscious, whispered her name as though it was the anchor that had kept him tethered to life. Those were the only acknowledgments that mattered. Hours blurred, reports were filed, blood was cleaned, the survivors stabilized, one by one, until the frantic pace slowed to something almost bearable. Sarah found herself sitting on a bench in the corridor outside the bay, her charts and gear piled uselessly at her side. Her hands still trembled. She clenched them into fists, pressing them against her knees until the shaking stopped. Across from her sank heavily onto the bench. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but his expression carried a quiet pride. "You know," he said, voice gravelly, "I've flown in 3 wars over deserts, jungles, ice, thought I'd seen it all." He looked at her. "But I've never seen anything like tonight. You read that storm like it was a book only you could see." Sarah exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "It wasn't just me, you trusted me, that's what made it work." Chuckled softly, "Trust is earned, and you earned it 10 times over." His words warmed her, but they also cut, because beneath the gratitude, a quiet truth lingered. If Hayes had trusted her hours earlier, they might have found the pilots sooner. They might not have bled so much. Silence stretched. The hallway was cold, quiet except for the faint hum of machines behind the medical bay doors. Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her voice soft. "They almost died because no one would listen." His jaw tightened. "They lived because you didn't stop trying." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching. "But what about the next time? The next officer who dismisses the weather girl? What happens when I'm not there?" The question hung heavy. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about ego. It was about lives. How many more would be risked because expertise came in the wrong uniform, the wrong voice, the wrong gender? His gaze softened. He didn't answer right away, then slowly he said, "Then you keep fighting to be heard until they can't ignore you anymore." Sarah's throat tightened. She nodded once, her chest aching with a mix of pride and weariness. The night dragged on. At dawn, pale light seeped through the narrow windows, painting the hallway in muted gray. Sarah hadn't slept. She sat watching the shadows shift, her mind replaying the night in fragments. Hayes's sneer, the helicopter shaking apart, the youngest pilot's whisper. A soft knock pulled her from the spiral. Doctor Warren stood there, a clipboard in hand, her eyes tired but bright. "Lieutenant," she said gently, "your analysis last night, it was beyond anything I've seen. The Pentagon will want a full report." Sarah blinked, startled. "The Pentagon?" Warren nodded. 8 pilots alive when they should be dead. They'll want to know how." She hesitated, then added, You've changed the conversation. Don't underestimate that. Sarah didn't answer at first. She thought of the storm, the way her instincts had carried them when machines failed. It wasn't new. It wasn't a miracle. It was the same thing her father had taught her in a small decades ago. The sky speaks, if you learn to listen. She finally said quietly, I didn't change anything. The storm was always speaking. Someone just had to hear it. Dr. Warren smiled faintly, as though recognizing the humility for what it was, a refusal to claim ownership over survival, even when it was deserved. As Warren left, Sarah leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to feel the exhaustion, the cracks in her armor. She had been dismissed, humiliated, underestimated. She had walked into the storm with nothing but instinct and determination, and she had brought every single one of them back. She wasn't proud, she wasn't triumphant, she was simply resolved. Because she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a fight bigger than any storm. What happens when the storm follows you home? Days blurred into one another. The mountains were quiet now, wrapped in snow and silence as though nothing had happened. But inside the base, the storm had only shifted forms. It no longer howled outside. It whispered in corridors, filled briefing rooms, lingered in the careful way officers glanced at Sarah when they thought she wasn't looking. The survivors were stabilizing. Some still hovered between life and death, but none had slipped away. That fact alone made the mission unforgettable. A full squadron brought back from the teeth of a storm. No one thought could be beaten. Sarah had hoped the noise would fade, that once the pilots were safe, she could return to her corner, her charts, her quiet work with the sky. But the world beyond the mountains had heard. It began with reporters, not on base, never that close, but circling outside, calling the public affairs office relentlessly. Then came the Pentagon's request for a detailed report. Then the messages from generals, senators, even whispers of the president himself being briefed. And at the center of it all was Sarah, the lieutenant who had been told to file paperwork, while 8 men froze in the dark. The debriefing room was stark, its walls lined with flags and photographs of campaigns past. At the long table sat officers of higher rank than Sarah had ever imagined being in the same room with. Some wore uniforms heavy with medals. Others were civilians in suits, their pens poised, eyes sharp. She sat at the far end, a folder of charts in her lap, her palms damp against the paper. Sat beside her, solid as an anchor, his presence a quiet reassurance. General, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, leaned forward. Lieutenant, walk us through it. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. She forced her voice steady as she opened the folder. The interference wasn't random. It cycled every 3 hours. A narrow window opened. 30 to 40 minutes, enough for entry and extraction if timed correctly. She laid out the charts, the data streams she had analyzed, the maps she had memorized. She spoke of downdrafts, crosswinds, the invisible tunnels the mountains carved through the air. Her words were precise, clinical, focused on the science. But she couldn't stop the memories from bleeding through. The smell of blood in the helicopter, the youngest pilot whispering her name, his hands trembling on the stick. Her voice faltered only once when she said softly, "If we had waited for the next window, they wouldn't have survived." The room was silent. Pens stopped moving. The weight of her words pressed against every man and woman at the table. General nodded once, and Captain Hayes's roll. Sarah hesitated, her stomach clenched. She could have destroyed him in a single sentence. She could have told them how he mocked her, dismissed her, silenced her, how his arrogance had nearly cost 8 lives. But she didn't. She met the general's eyes, her voice calm. He followed procedure. I disagreed with his assessment. Shifted slightly beside her, his jaw tightening as though he wanted to say more, but he didn't. He let her choice stand. Because Sarah wasn't here to humiliate anyone. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for truth. and the truth was already louder than any accusation she could make. The questions continued, technical, tactical, political. She answered each with clarity, even as fatigue dragged at her bones. When it was over, General closed the folder in front of him. "You saved 8 pilots, Lieutenant. That's not just analysis, that's leadership. The department will be reviewing your role with great interest." The word leadership echoed in Sarah's chest. It didn't feel like leadership. It had felt like desperation, like clinging to instinct when no one else would listen. When the session adjourned, Sarah stepped out into the corridor, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and coffee. Reporters waited outside the gates, though she avoided them, slipping back into the shadows where she felt most at home. That night in the quiet of her quarters, she sat on her bunk staring at her hands. They still shook sometimes, as though the storm hadn't left her body. She thought of the pilots, the sound of their breathing, the look in their eyes when they realized they were safe. That was what mattered, not medals, not promotions. But the system didn't think that way. The system wanted stories, narratives, heroes. 2 days later, knocked on her door, he leaned against the frame, his face lined with fatigue but softened with something gentler. "Word from D.C.," he said. "They're putting you in for commendation, high level. You might want to prepare for speeches, ceremonies, the works." Sarah looked at him, her chest tightening. "I don't want a medal, Jack. I just want them to listen next time." His eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Sometimes the medal's not for you, it's for them. A way of admitting they were wrong." Sarah didn't respond. She turned away, her gaze drifting to the window where the mountains loomed in the distance, quiet and indifferent. Recognition felt hollow. What did it matter if her name was polished in speeches, if the next lieutenant in her place was ignored until it was too late? The pilots visited her one by one when they were strong enough to walk first, leaning on crutches, his grin crooked but alive. "You ever get tired of being right?" he asked, his voice rough with healing lungs. She smiled faintly. "Every day." Came next, his arm still bound in a sling. He didn't joke. He simply gripped her shoulder with his good hand, his eyes holding hers with the unspoken weight of a man who understood what it meant to carry others out of hell. The youngest came last, pale but upright, a scar bisecting his temple. He struggled to meet her eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't give up on us." Sarah's throat tightened. She forced herself to speak. "Neither did you." They left her with something medals couldn't give, the quiet certainty that what she had done mattered, not to the system, to them. But outside the hospital walls, the narrative grew louder. Articles called her the weather whisperer, the storm lieutenant, the woman who commanded. Photographers wanted her picture. Commentators wanted her story. She hated it, because none of them knew what it had felt like in the cockpit, the weight of 8 fragile lives pressing against her every breath. None of them knew the terror of seeing instruments spin blind, the helplessness of knowing a single wrong call could end them all. They wanted a hero. She remembered fear. One night found her again, sitting alone in the hangar, staring at the silent helicopters lined up like sleeping beasts. "You're avoiding the spotlight," he said. "I don't belong in it," she murmured. He stepped closer, his voice firm. "You belong exactly where you are, not because you wanted it, because you earned it, and because every young lieutenant who comes after you needs to see it's possible." Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing deep. She didn't want the fight. She wanted the sky, the charts, the quiet of listening to currents no one else heard. But she also remembered the briefing room, Hayes's smirk, the silence that nearly killed 8 men. And she knew was right. Sometimes dignity doesn't want the stage, but sometimes it has to stand on it, if only so the next voice isn't ignored. Sarah opened her eyes. The helicopters gleamed faintly under the hangar lights, their metal skins reflecting her shadow. The storm had passed, but the fight was just beginning. How do you stand tall when the spotlight burns brighter than the storm? The ceremony was staged with precision. Rows of uniforms gleamed under polished lights, brass buttons catching the sun that filtered through tall windows. Flags lined the hall in perfect symmetry. The air smelled faintly of starch and fresh paint, as though even the building itself had been scrubbed for the occasion. Sarah stood at the center, her dress blue stiff and unfamiliar, the silver pins on her chest feeling heavier than they should. She hated the weight of ceremony, the silence before applause, the expectation to smile. General stood at the podium, his voice booming across the hall. On the night of the storm, when every instrument failed and every calculation pointed to disaster, one officer refused to accept defeat. Lieutenant Sarah read the skis when no machine could, and because of her, 8 of our own are alive today. Applause rose, echoing through the hall like thunder. Sarah's stomach twisted. She felt eyes on her, hundreds of them. Yet all she wanted was the dark cockpit, the roar of rotors, the invisible pulse of wind beneath her palms. The general beckoned her forward. She walked to the podium, boots clicking against polished wood, her body stiff with unease. Watched from the front row, his expression steady, supportive. Hayes was there too, his posture straight but his eyes downcast as though applause itself cut into him. The medal was pinned to her chest. Cameras flashed, capturing her face in stark bursts of white. The general's words washed over her. Courage, ingenuity, unshakable resolve, words that felt hollow, disconnected from the storm's reality. Sarah forced herself to stand tall, but inside, she heard the youngest pilot's labored breathing. She saw the blood soaking into stretchers, the terror in his jaw as the helicopter bucked. She remembered her own voice breaking on the edge of panic as instruments spun blind. Hero, the word didn't fit. When the applause faded and she stepped back into her seat, she caught his eye. He gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement not of the medal, not of the ceremony, but of the truth between them. What happened in the storm wasn't glory, it was survival. Afterward, reporters swarmed. Their voices overlapped in a blur of questions. Lieutenant, what was going through your mind when command ordered you to stand down? How does it feel to be the first female officer to lead such a mission? Do you see yourself as a role model for women in the armed forces? Sarah's lips parted, but no words came. What could she say? That she had been terrified, that her mind had screamed she might kill them all with a single wrong call, that she had only done what any of them would have done if they could hear the storm the way she did. She forced her voice steady. I didn't do it alone. Major trusted me. The crew risked everything. The pilots fought to stay alive. It wasn't one person, it was all of us. But that wasn't the headline they wanted. By evening, the stories had already spread. The storm lieutenant, the woman who wouldn't back down. It felt like theft, not of credit. She didn't want credit, but of truth. That night back in her quarters, Sarah sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the metal glinting on the table. She picked it up once, felt the cool metal against her skin, then set it back down. It was beautiful, polished, meaningless. Her door clicked, stepped in without waiting for permission, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to her and sank into the chair opposite. You looked like you wanted to vanish out there, he said. I did, Sarah murmured. She sipped the bitter coffee, grateful for the warmth. They talk like it was courage, like I wasn't terrified. His gaze softened. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing it anyway. Sarah shook her head. They don't understand the cost, the weight. They see a medal. I see blood on the cabin floor. Leaned forward, his voice low. Let them tell their stories. You know the truth. The pilots know the truth. I know the truth. That's what matters. She wanted to believe him, but as days passed, the noise only grew. Interviews, photographs, invitations to speak at academies. She declined most, but some she couldn't. At the Air Force Academy, cadets leaned forward in their seats as she spoke. She told them about weather systems, about reading patterns, about trusting instinct. But when one young woman asked, "How do you get them to listen when they don't believe you?" Sarah froze. Her throat tightened. She thought of Hayes, of every time she had been dismissed, ignored, sidelined. She answered softly, "You keep speaking, even when they don't want to hear, especially then." The cadet nodded, eyes bright, as though she had been waiting for those words. Later, alone in her hotel room, Sarah sat by the window, staring at the city lights. She wondered if that was why all this mattered. Not the medals, not the speeches, but the chance that someone else wouldn't be silenced when it counted most. But even as she thought it, she felt the weight again. 8 men lived, yes, but they lived with scars. Some would never fly again. Some would wake screaming from dreams of fire and wind. And Sarah would carry them too, every face, every gasp of breath. The storm hadn't left her, it lived in her now. Weeks later, when the noise began to fade, she walked alone to the edge of the airfield. The helicopters sat in neat rows, blades still, their hulking frames casting long shadows in the setting sun. She closed her eyes and lifted her face to the wind. It was calm tonight, gentle against her skin, but she could still hear the echoes, the roar of turbulence, the crackle of failing instruments, the desperate voices over the radio. She opened her eyes slowly, whispering into the quiet. It wasn't about medals, it was about not letting them die. Her words vanished into the dusk, swallowed by the horizon. And yet saying them aloud eased something in her chest. She turned, walking back toward the barracks, her steps steady, her shoulders squared. The world could keep its ceremonies. The pilots had gone home alive. That was all the victory she needed. What happens after the storm ends? For most, life moved on. The headlines faded, replaced by new stories. The applause quieted. Even the medal, once paraded across newsfeeds, became just another decoration among many in the long halls of military history. But for Sarah, the storm lingered. It stayed in the way she jolted awake at night, heart pounding, certain the helicopter was dropping out of the sky again. It lived in the smell of hydraulic oil that seemed to cling to her hands no matter how many times she washed them. It whispered in the silence between briefings, when she caught herself listening for the faint pulse of a beacon she'd already found. She didn't resent it, not entirely. Some scars become part of you, reminders of what you carried and what carried you. But she also knew she couldn't let the storm be the only story. One crisp morning, weeks after the ceremony, Sarah stood at the edge of the training grounds. The sky was clear, the mountains distant and deceptively calm. Cadets moved across the field in disciplined lines, their voices sharp, their steps unified. A young woman broke formation, jogging toward her. Sarah recognized her. The cadet who had asked how to make them listen. Her eyes were wide, eager, a notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "Ma'am," she said, breathless, "I just wanted to thank you after your talk. I spoke up in class. I corrected my instructor. He didn't like it, but he listened, and I was right." Her voice trembled, but her pride shone through. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She placed a hand gently on the cadet's shoulder. "Good, that's how it starts, not by shouting the loudest, by refusing to be silent when silence would cost too much." The cadet smiled, nodded, and ran back to formation. Sarah watched her go, her chest tight. Maybe had been right. Maybe the medal wasn't for her. Maybe it was for them. For every young officer who needed to see that the storm could be survived, that silence wasn't the only path. Later that evening, Sarah visited the hangar. The helicopters sat quiet in the fading light, their blades motionless, their shadows stretching long across the floor. She walked between them slowly, her boots echoing against the concrete. She stopped at the one they had flown that night. The bird was patched now, cleaned, polished, no trace of blood, no sign of the fight it had endured, but Sarah remembered every jolt, every scream of metal, every breath held between calls. She rested her hand on its side, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did it somehow." A faint smile touched her lips, though her eyes stung. His voice came from behind her, steady and warm. "You're still carrying it, aren't you?" Sarah turned to see him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. She exhaled slowly. "I think I always will." He walked closer, his footsteps echoing. "That's not weakness, that's the proof it mattered." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the hum of distant generators the only sound. Then said quietly, "You know, storms don't really end, they just move, but so do we, and that's what survival is." Sarah looked at him, then back at the helicopter. She nodded. "Yeah, survival isn't the end, it's the beginning of carrying what you saved." Outside, the evening air shifted, a soft breeze rustling through the open hangar doors. She stepped toward it, feeling the cool touch against her skin. It reminded her of that night. Not the violence of the storm, but the moment they broke free, the air thinning, the light returning. She closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. The applause had faded, the medal sat untouched, the headlines belonged to someone else now. But the truth remained. She had refused silence. She had fought to be heard, not with anger or arrogance, but with the quiet strength of someone who knew lives depended on it. And because of that, 8 men breathed. She didn't need the world to remember. She only needed to know she had done what was right, even when it cost her peace, even when it left scars. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it doesn't shout, it doesn't demand the spotlight. It simply acts. And that was enough.